Welcome to the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act, or EMCPA, as we'll refer to it as, law enforcement tutorial, providing you an agency-neutral view. So irrespective of whatever law enforcement tenure you may be in, if you are currently, or will be for that matter, enforcing the EMCPA, this presentation will provide just the facts, just the straight goods applicable to you in endeavoring to enforce this act. And for some of you who already know me, this obviously won't come as new news to you, but for those of you who don't know me, my name is Brian Last, Sergeant Special Constable, former POA prosecutor, contributor to Blue Line Magazine, and really the list goes on, and I do welcome you to this presentation, and thank you for joining. So, first and foremost, a quick disclaimer. No, this presentation is not to be construed as legal advice. And of course, always at the end of the day, you should follow your agency's directions with respect to not only enforcing the EMCPA, but anything else they may provide direction on for that matter. So, the best first question to ask, of course, what is the EMCPA? Well, quite simply, the EMCPA, it's an act of the Legislative Assembly of Ontario, so a provincial statute, which quite simply allows the Premier of Ontario to declare a state of emergency, and of course, that is exactly what has happened. Premier Ford, on March 17th, did declare a state of emergency here, which we are still in that state of emergency here in the province, of course, respective of the current COVID-19 pandemic, and the respective sections of the EMCPA you see on your screen basically speak to just that. Now, why this is relevant is, well, quite simply, as you can see, COVID-19 does equate to that of an emergency, as just stated. So, as far as the definition of what emergency is in the Act, for lack of a better description, a global pandemic most certainly fits the bill. But with that aside, again, why this is relevant, declaring the state of emergency, this basically activates the EMCPA, if I can word it that way, which allows the Premier to, basically move forward, and respective of the further sections you currently see on your screen, the Premier can basically put into place emergency orders, and of course that's what the Premier has been doing on a regular basis. Basically, when he's providing the directives as to what we can and cannot do, inevitably these are getting put into the forms of actual regulations under the EMCPA, and it is these regulations that we as law enforcement professionals will actually be enforcing, and this will make a bit more sense as we move on. But quite simply, as far as the criteria is concerned for passing these orders, to use some of the language in the section you see on your screen, obviously this lends to preventing, reducing, or mitigating serious harms to persons, as it relates, of course, speaking specific to the current landscape that is the coronavirus pandemic. So, again, another simple equation for you. These emergency orders, as stated, that the Premier is putting into place, all lending to trying to flatten the curve, as the catchphrase goes, or to combat or attempt to combat the COVID-19 pandemic. So, with respect to enforcement, I know I just alluded that it's these regulations that are being passed under the EMCPA, these emergency orders that we will be enforcing, and most certainly this picture of the Provincial Offences Court on your screen, it's not by accident that that's there, because quite simply, as mentioned, the EMCPA is a provincial statute, so in other words, all the proceedings under this act will be commenced under the umbrella of the Provincial Offences Act, or the POA. And of course, you can see some examples: Part 1 offense notice, Part 1 summons for that matter, Part 3 short form summons, and the list goes on. Just as a quick FYI, on the topic of commencing a proceeding under an actual regulation or another emergency order, which you can actually see on your screen, the province has gone so far to actually suspend any limitation periods, all the statutes of limitations, respective of Part 1, 2, and 3, retroactive to March 16th, 2020. Of course, this lends to the fact that there's court closures, justices of the peace are not accepting informations, etc., etc. Now, I know some people who are a little bit more legally savvy may be saying, well, what about someone's right to a trial within a timely fashion, Section 11B of the Charter? Well, under the still somewhat recent framework of R.V. Jordan, the new framework of R.V. Jordan, I'm inclined to suggest that perhaps a global pandemic certainly weighs in the favor of the Crown for an exceptional circumstance outside of their, outside of their ability to control it, really. So that's enough of that for right now, and we'll move on and talk about the actual offenses. Now, there are 3 offenses under the EMCPA. Now, of course, this schedule, if I can word it that way, is taken right from the Ontario Court of Justice website. This is taken as well, further than that, right from Regulation 950 under the POA. And what's interesting about the three offenses under the EMCPA is that they all share the same section number. Now, this will make a lot more sense when you read the actual long-form wording. They've basically done some play on words, taken from the full wording of this respective section, section 7.0.11 sub 1 paragraph A. But I'm inclined to suggest to you that the first of the three that failed to comply with an order made during a declared emergency, that's really the biggie. That's sort of in line with what we've been speaking about here with these emergency orders, people not complying with the orders, and as such, we can, of course, charge them, as this suggests, under the EMCPA. Now, the actual set fines, as you can still see here, as recent as March 18th, being passed by the Chief Justice of Ontario, March 18th. And they are quite hefty for set fines, but, the absolute maximums are pretty hefty as well. But, of course, if you were to proceed by Part 1, by way of a ticket, so to speak, these would be the set fines respective of these charges. And as made mention, this, of course, is the long-form wording. And if you want, you can hit the pause button and read this a little bit more in depth to see just how, large these maximum penalties can get. And as well, the respective long-form wording of the actual offense itself. You can see how the language is embedded in there, respective of all three offenses, the actual not complying with the order and the two different obstruct charges. So, what are these orders that we can actually enforce? And of course, on our screen, we can see a bunch of messaging from numerous enforcement agencies. But, really just to get right into it and address this at a high level, first and foremost, for a full listing of all these actual emergency orders, I've put a link up on your screen. When you do go to that link, as stated at the bottom of this slide, simply scroll down to the page to where it says emergency orders, and you will see the ever-growing list of all these emergency orders under the EMCPA. But before we get into it, of course, a quick disclaimer from our friend the professor here. Really, at the end of the day, as with sort of any enforcement action, but especially something like the EMCPA and this absolutely confusing, unprecedented, ever-changing, landscape, really, that is what exactly we're dealing with this pandemic. Really, the collective goal here is education, to educate the public. Obviously, we're hearing all sorts of messaging every day as to what we can and can't do as far as social distancing and gatherings, etc., etc. So really, at the end of the day, all the slide is saying is just to heed on the side of caution. Always use your verbal intervention skills. Hopefully, education and verbal warnings is enough to curb whatever you're coming across. And obviously, as well, we've been granted a great deal of power under the EMCPA and these further orders, and of course this should not be taken lightly. But with that out of the way, the first of the regulations we'll look at very quickly, as I'm sure you can already take a guess what this is based on these photographs. This speaks to organized public events and certain gatherings. So this all has to do with what we've been hearing a lot about, social gatherings. Now, as I advance the slide here, and again, with all these regulations, you'll want to hit the pause button and sort of read it a little bit more in depth and internalize it. But again, this speaking specific to that of what we've been hearing about social gatherings. Specifically, a gathering of more than 5 people. This is applicable to private dwellings as well. The one thing I will say about this, however, here on the side of caution, because if you do come into a predicament, even at a private dwelling of over 5 people, well, if they're all actual members of the single household, or even for public for that matter, if they're all members of the same household, they have not committed an offense. And further, for the purposes specific to that of funerals, there is an allowance of not more than 10 persons. So again, you'll want to hit the pause button and perhaps read this a little bit more in depth. The next regulation we'll look at, as far as that can be enforced under the EMCPA, is closure of establishments. And, this unto itself, of course, confusing, much like the complete landscape, as I've already alluded to. But as we get right into it, what I will perhaps point out specifically, and arguably this is a scenario you may come across more so than some of the other items listed under this regulation, is that of number 5, all bars and restaurants, except to the extent that such facilities provide takeout food and delivery. So in other words, if they don't provide takeout food or delivery, they have to be closed. There's no dine-in, again, takeout and delivery only. But again, you'll want to read all the specifics. And if you come across a scenario in which you have reasonable probable grounds to believe someone, a corporation or an individual, has basically found themselves lending to any of these predicaments. Of course, it is enforceable under the EMCPA. Next one we'll look at closure of outdoor recreational amenities. Pretty self-explanatory. You can see some pictures of some examples of what this would be alluding to: off-leash dog parks, picnic areas, baseball diamonds. And again, as I sort of go through the slides, you can see there's a pretty extensive list. Again, you'll want to hit the pause button, read this, but what I will tell you, and what I'll lend your attention to, the very bottom of this slide, which adds to a little bit of confusion, and I'll read this verbatim: for greater certainty, nothing in this order precludes individuals from walking through or using portions of park and recreational areas that are not otherwise closed and then that, do not contain an outdoor recreational amenity described in subsection 2. So a little bit confusing. Heed on the side of caution. Always follow the direction of your agency, but basically, as we all know, and as it's been stated in the media, we still have an ability to go out there, go for our walks, still practicing proper social distancing protocols, et cetera, et cetera. So, really at the end of the day, if anyone's sort of lingering, loitering, or sauntering in any one specific spot, lending to any of the threshold under this regulation, obviously enforceable, but, again, err on the side of caution. And as I advance, this regulation may be one of my favorites, speaking specific to that of the enforcement of orders, and you could probably already have an idea what we're alluding to based on the picture of the driver's license and photo card. This regulation all having to do with the fact that, there's now this fail to ID clause. So any individual who is now a would-be defendant, you're investigating them under the EMCPA, you have reasonable grounds to believe they've committed an offense, you're investigating them, and you want to charge them, well, they do have to provide you with the particulars you would need to fill out either a ticket or a summons. They can do this either by photo ID or verbally with you confirming it, but they, again, if that's the circumstance, you're investigating, there's grounds to charge them, you intend to charge them, they do have to provide those particulars to you and shall promptly comply. However, as bolded in red, you cannot compel someone to provide any other information further than that in this actual regulation, further than that of the particulars to charge them, because you intend to do that. So in other words, if you're trying to figure out if a bunch of people live together or not to see if you have grounds for an offense, that is not a situation in which you can compel someone to provide any sort of information. There's nothing further than just these particulars to ID to charge them that you can compel someone to provide you. So something to err on the side of caution. Now, what I will tell you as far as, still on the same line with the fail to ID clause, as far as your teeth under this act, there is no arrest authority under the EMCPA, and now I'm speaking more specifically to those of you who have, police or peace officer powers. But what I will tell you as far as the messaging from the Solicitor General and the directorship in the respective Crown's office, should you be in a circumstance as a peace officer in which you're investigating someone under the EMCPA, they failed to ID, or provide a false ID for that matter, this most certainly is a scenario as to which would construe obstructing a peace officer. Here you are as a peace officer in the execution of your duty. You intend to charge the person. You're enforcing the EMCPA. They are most certainly obstructing you, this would-be defendant, by not providing you the appropriate IDs. So again, the messaging as of right now is this scenario most certainly would construe to obstruct peace officer. Of course, there is a respective arrest authority. What I would say, and what has been sort of suggested as a best practice, should you find someone or find yourself rather arresting someone, if push comes to shove, it gets egregious enough that you do have to do this, and you do arrest someone for obstruct peace officer, the messaging is the best practice is to not only charge this person with the two respective EMCPA offenses that started this off, being the failing to comply with the order as well as the obstruct charge under the EMCPA, but you would want to endeavor to charge them with obstruct peace officer as well by way of a Form 9 appearance notice. Of course, going in line, presuming this person's releasable, the acronym price has been satisfied, but this can all form part of the same brief. As per the recent case law of R.V. Skaska, the judge in the provincial court of justice, Ontario Court of Justice, the provincial court judge, does have jurisdiction to hear all these together. Okay, and again, you'll always want to follow your agency's direction speaking to this anyways. So, a couple things just to clarify very quickly, because we've been hearing about this whole having to stay apart 2 meters in public. So, again, just to clarify, this is not an order under the EMCPA. This is specific to the City of Toronto bylaw, applicable only to those provincial offences officers with the City of Toronto and perhaps Toronto Police for that matter. So, again, that is not enforceable under the EMCPA. And one thing further, speaking to the whole idea of having to self-isolate after coming back from traveling abroad, this 14-day isolation period. This is an emergency order. However, it is under the Quarantine Act, federal legislation, not enforceable. I repeat, not enforceable under the EMCPA. However, how a peace officer would endeavor to deal with this, as I advance the slide, as far as the Quarantine Act goes, a peace officer acts under the direction of or to the assistance of a quarantine officer or screening officer. So you'll want to hit the pause button and read this a little bit more specifically, but I'll bring your attention to the yellow highlighted portion of this screen. Basically, there's a phone number there. If you have a scenario which you believe someone is disobeying this emergency order to self-isolate, you will call this number. It will put you in touch with the Public Health Agency of Canada. You'll tell them the scenario, and whether or not it's warranted in the circumstances, they will pass you on to a quarantine officer, and you'll sort of take it from there. So that's the short version of that type of scenario. And with all that being said, it's a wealth of information, but I do thank you for tuning in. Needless to say, it's a very unprecedented, dynamic time, but, I extend a huge thank you not only to all of you watching, but to all our frontline workers, all the emergency personnel, all our essential workers, and, let's all stay safe and take care of each other, and I will see you on the other side of this pandemic. Bye for now.